All right. Hello, everyone. This is Dan Waits from World Astrology Report coming to you live. Now, I don't go live very often, but I decided to this week just because of everything that's been happening with this war in the Middle East between Iran and Israel and the US now. So, what I wanted to do is just offer an astrological perspective on what's going on and where things might be going. And unfortunately, my main message right now is that I don't think this is over. I think we're going to see a lot more from this conflict. So, let's get into this. I have a presentation for you. I'm going to run through it for you right now. Okay, so back in April of last year, 2024, I put out this video. It was called Astrology Warning Iran and Israel at War. And if you remember what was going on in April of 2024, we saw an exchange of attacks between Iran and Israel. The situation was pretty similar to what we've seen in the last few days. And what I said in that video is that that start of this direct conflict between Iran and Israel, because they hadn't been attacking each other directly until that point. Clearly, these two countries have been in a proxy war for some time, but they hadn't been attacking each other directly. And what I noted in that video back in April 2024 was that these attacks had come at a pretty critical moment because they'd come at the start of a planetary cycle, the Mars-Saturn cycle. And what that told us is that essentially conflict between these two countries was baked in to that Mars-Saturn cycle that began back then in April 2024. Mars and Saturn, right? In traditional astrology, these are the two malefic planets. They are there to prune things, cut things away. They're life-denying planets. And their cycle lasts about 2 years. And what you tend to see is that some of the more difficult things that are going on in the world, whether it's wars, whether it's even the COVID pandemic, major events and developments in those themes tend to synchronize with the rhythm of this cycle. And you tend to find that when the planets make major aspects with each other, when they make conjunctions, squares, oppositions, even sextiles and trines, you tend to see major events related to difficult, challenging themes. So back in April, on April the 10th of 2024, we saw a conjunction of Mars and Saturn in the sign of Pisces. So this was the beginning of a cycle of challenge that would last about 2 years. And what happened around this time? Well, Israel attacked the Iranian consulate in Syria's capital of Damascus. They killed quite a few Iranian commanders. And this was an extremely provocative attack, right, to destroy a foreign country, even an adversary's diplomatic premises like this. That's a very provocative act. So Iran responded to Israel, right? We had this direct attack from Iran on Israel with over 300 drones and missiles at that time. And this was the first time that Iran had attacked Israel directly, right? So Iran has its proxies, it has Hamas, Hezbollah, and so forth. But Iran hadn't directly attacked Israel before. And then the Israelis responded again. They attacked Iran. They attacked some targets in Isfahan, which is one of the places where Iran's nuclear program is based. So we have these events taking place, and because of the moment in time that it happened, because we know that there's a conjunction of Mars and Saturn at this time, we know that this is a theme that's now baked in to the synodic cycle of Mars and Saturn. And unfortunately, we can deduce from that that we're going to see more conflict between Israel and Iran. The cycles theme was established at that time, in other words. Okay, now we move forward in time. We move to August of 2024. This was when Mars and Saturn reached their waxing square, their first hard aspect of their synodic cycle. And what happened at this time? Well, we saw a very similar situation. So, right at the end of July, I think it was July the 31st or around that time, we saw Israel carry out the assassination of Fuad Shukr, who was a Hezbollah commander in Beirut, capital of Lebanon. And we saw Israel assassinate the Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran itself, in the capital of Iran. So we're coming to the square and we're seeing very similar themes coming up again. And then over the course of August, there was, if you remember, there was this kind of real tension about whether or not Iran would respond and when they would respond. I believe that Iran basically said it was going to have its revenge on Israel for these attacks. This is just a news story that I've clipped. Iran and Hezbollah attack on Israel imminent, Blinken tells G7. So we had this very similar situation in August to what we had in April, right? We had attacks between these states, or we have Israel attacking and assassinating Iranian leaders. And then we have this situation where the world is waiting to see what happens. It was essentially the same. And eventually, actually not in August though, quite a bit later, Iran launched its revenge attack on Israel. It launched about 180 ballistic missiles at Israel. So this was confirmation of the theme of this cycle, right? Because we see the cycle beginning in April. We have an idea of what this cycle is about based on what we've seen, and then we get to the square and we get confirmation because we see very similar themes playing out again. Another theme of this cycle, by the way, that may also come up in future is that there seems to have been attacks and damage to Zaporizhia nuclear power plant in Ukraine. This happened in April, on the 7th of April. Russia says Ukraine attack hits Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. And then in August at the square, we have a fire at the nuclear plant, and both sides are blaming each other for causing this fire at the plant. It's currently held by Russia. This cycle began in Pisces. Pisces is a bit of a confusing and deceptive sign at times. So one aspect of all of this stuff that we've been seeing between Iran and Israel, and also between Ukraine and Russia as regards this power plant, is there's some sort of element of perhaps of deception. People aren't telling the truth. Things are being done for show. Other things that we don't know about happening in the background. That all feels quite Pisces to me. Okay, let's fast forward now to this year and to May the 25th, when Saturn moves into Aries. You've probably noticed there's been a really big shift in the tone in world events since around that time, since about a month ago. We've seen a lot more pressure, right? Saturn just brings pressure, responsibility, um, raises the stakes wherever you find it. And it's doing that in Aries now. Aries is the sign of Mars. Mars is the planet of war. And we've seen the stakes being raised massively in all these conflicts around the world. You'll remember not so long ago, we had these protests, riots, whatever you want to call them, in LA. And if you looked at all the headlines, they were all talking about potential for civil war in the US. You also had massive swing in the violence in the conflict in Ukraine. You had this alleged attack by the Ukrainians on Vladimir Putin's helicopter. You had this attack by the Ukrainians on Russia's bomber fleet deep inside Russia. The Russians were responding with drone attacks on Kiev. The intensity of that conflict, the stakes just seem to rise quite a lot. And we've also now seen it in the Middle East. So it's just happening everywhere, really. Saturn in Aries just seems to have inflamed the situation and raised the stakes in armed conflict around the world. Now, in the middle of this month, it went exact on the 15th of June, we had a square between Mars and Uranus. Now, squares are generally aspects we can associate with friction, action, conflict. Mars-Uranus combinations, they tend to be explosive. Mars, the planet of war, action, conflict. Uranus, surprising, shocking, fast-acting events, right? These combinations are pretty reliable in terms of bringing explosive situations around the world. So we have this in the middle of June. What do we see? Well, we have this Israeli assault on Iran, right? Israel hits Iran's nuclear program and military leadership in unprecedented strikes on June the 13th, right? So just before this exact Mars-Uranus square, well within orb, we see this this attack by Israel on all these facilities and leaders in Iran. And the Israelis called this Operation Rising Lion. And I think that's pretty interesting because we all know that really the intention or what they were trying to do is they wanted to bring the US into this conflict, right? That was clearly the intention. They want to draw the US into conflict with Iran. And of course, there are a lot of people in the US that want that conflict as well. And there was all this question about, will Trump be drawn into it or not? Now, again, Operation Rising Lion. Trump is a Leo rising. And as we saw in the middle of June, we have this Mars-Uranus square, and it's right on Trump's ascendant, right? Mars here is conjunct his ascendant, which happens to be the fixed star Regulus. But it's so strange that they've called it Operation Rising Lion. It's aimed at baiting Trump into this conflict if he wasn't in on it all along. And that's Trump's rising sign, and that's where Mars is. It's almost as if this was some sort of deliberate kind of almost like they maybe have been looking at Trump's astrology. There are strange synchronicities. Synchronicity is a fact of life in this cosmos, absolutely. But sometimes you see things like this, and it makes you think they have to be using astrology there. And then, of course, we did indeed see the US joining this conflict, right? We have US strikes on 3 Iranian nuclear sites. And the Iranians responded. We have the Iran attacking this US airbase in Qatar. They didn't really do much damage. They, in fact, warned the Americans in advance that they were going to do this. Trump calls Iran's retaliatory strike very weak, says the country gave early notice of attack. So this was almost just a kind of symbolic response. Seems to suggest, they didn't want this to escalate, given that they warned the Americans in advance. So the question is, what next? Well, you might have noticed there are all these stories appearing already that are talking about how these strikes on Iran's nuclear program supposedly haven't set back the program. If it even, there's debate over whether Iran has even been trying to develop nuclear weapons. The IAEA says no. A lot of inspectors say no. So it seems quite likely that they weren't actually doing that. even if they were enriching uranium and maybe had the potential to do it in future. But anyway, you're seeing these stories kind of saying that basically these strikes against Iran haven't been enough, and you can almost wonder why all these stories appearing. Is this a sort of attempt to kind of prepare the ground for more violence in future? And one of the factors we have to bear in mind, this is a story from a few days ago. Netanyahu says regime change in Iran could be a result of Israel's attacks. I mean, let's be real. Netanyahu wants to see regime change in Iran. That's the goal, I think, of the Israelis, or at least his faction. And a lot of neocons in the US also want to see regime change in Iran, but regime change hasn't happened. And I suspect that's one indicator, without looking at the astrology, that we haven't seen the last of this. This is not enough. This is not. I don't think this has satisfied Netanyahu and the neocons. This isn't giving them what they want. They want an end to the regime in Iran. Okay, now the astrological reason, or at least one of them, you could find a lot of them, no doubt, but one of them why I think this conflict is not over is that we haven't even reached the opposition of this Mars-Saturn cycle. The opposition is coming in early August, 9th of August would be the exact opposition, depending on where in the world you are. So this cycle is still in its waxing phase. We haven't seen its full fruition yet. That's coming in early August. And given the themes that we've seen, whenever Mars and Saturn have made hard aspects with each other during this cycle, we've seen Iran and Israel attacking each other. This, to me, suggests that's what's going to come again in early August. But there's something more going on with this moment in time, as you'll know already if you watch my channel regularly, because Mars and Saturn, you can see Mars and Saturn are going to be in an opposition, but they're making this incredible configuration with the outer planets. Saturn is conjunct Neptune here. So it's not just Mars opposite Saturn, it's Mars opposing Saturn, Neptune. But then we also have Uranus and Pluto. They're making sextiles with this Saturn-Neptune conjunction. They're making trines with each other. And they are also trining Mars. So this is a really incredible thing to see in the sky from a sort of geometrical perspective. You can see it's making what we call a kite configuration. And it's difficult to know what this promises, because we haven't really seen much astrology like this in the past. There's not really a chart you can go back to in history where you can see something like this and look at what happened. One thing I have mentioned on the channel before is there was an astrologer called Lynn Coyner who did some research into kite patterns. She said that they tended to coincide with disasters. Disasters, sometimes man-made, that ended up resulting in changes to regulations and action taken to prevent them from happening again. That's where her research took her. And I think more broadly, this configuration of the outer planets is signaling the emergence of a new multipolar world. And something that I've identified about this moment in time is that we can actually cast a chart for when the nuclear age began. It began arguably on the 2nd of December 1942, when scientists in Chicago created the first controlled nuclear fission reaction. So they basically demonstrated that this technology was viable, that they could generate power from it. So that gives us this chart for the nuclear age. And we're not going to do a big analysis of this chart, but what we can see is that this configuration in August is making really interesting or concerning aspects, if you like, with this nuclear age chart, because we've got this Mars-Saturn opposition in the 2nd degree of Aries and Libra, and it's right over the Moon and Neptune in this nuclear age chart. We're also reaching the Uranus return because when Uranus was in very early Gemini, we saw this beginning of the nuclear age. So natally to the nuclear age, Uranus is at 2 Gemini here. That's where Uranus is going to be. So it's a Uranus return. But also in the nuclear age chart, Pluto was in Leo, early Leo. Pluto's now in early Aquarius, not far from an opposition. And of course, Neptune is making its opposition with its natal position. So what we're seeing is we're seeing important turning points, cyclical important moments in the cycle of all three outer planets with regard to the nuclear age. And I'm interpreting this as telling us that there's some sort of turning point coming here around nuclear technology. This is something I've been talking about for quite some time. And we don't know exactly what form this turning point is going to take, but there, you could imagine some possibilities. Could there be some sort of incident involving nuclear contamination? Could there be the use of a nuclear weapon? Could there be a close call where we see the world coming very close to some sort of nuclear disaster, and then there's some sort of impulse towards preventing it from happening again? That would be probably a more hopeful scenario. But round about this time, over the next few months, we're somehow reaching this turning point, and the astrology is showing this, but we're seeing it in the news, right? Because nuclear technology is at the heart of this conflict that we've seen, or at least one of the factors that's at the heart of the conflict. Obviously, there are deep fundamentals behind it as well. And one of the videos that I made on this subject came out a few weeks ago. I worked with a remote viewer, Josh Maitland, to look at what events might be coming around the time of early August, late July. And Josh saw a lot of interesting stuff, some quite worrying stuff. We did this blind, meaning I didn't tell Josh what I was asking him to look at, although we didn't do it double blind. Double blind is how you really are supposed to do remote viewing, technically, in that I shouldn't have given Josh the tasking, should have given it to somebody else who gave it to him, because he knows it's come from me. So there is that caveat to what Josh saw. But he did several sessions of remote viewing on what the astrology of early August might be signifying and what the consequences of whatever happens then might be. I suggest you watch that video if you want more on this, if you haven't seen it already. He did see the theme of nukes come up quite a lot, and he also saw UFOs and nukes specifically. And obviously, that's another topic that I've talked a lot about. I really do believe that we are going to be seeing and hearing a lot more about that in the next few weeks, even. Probably it's Uranus going into Gemini on July the 7th, I think is probably going to supercharge this issue because it's already something we're hearing more and more about. Something is going on there. And something about the UFO phenomenon is it is very closely linked with nuclear technology. There's a whole book, UFOs and Nukes, by Robert Hastings, a researcher on UFOs, who found many dozens, maybe hundreds of incidents of UFOs showing an interest in nuclear sites, nuclear bases, even switching missiles off and on, and showing that they had some kind of power over the technology. So these themes are linked somehow, and the phenomenon, the UFO phenomenon, really kind of came into being around the same time as the first nuclear weapons were used. Right, we go to 1945, we have the use of the first nuclear weapons, and it's around this time that the UFO, the flying saucer, is kind of entering public consciousness. And I don't know if anybody really knows for sure what the answer to why that's happening. We all have theories, but certainly these topics are linked. Josh saw that topic coming up around this astrology, and that outer planet configuration of Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto is very otherworldly. I would say that. Some other suggestions of how this may not be over here. So this is the chart of Israel, dated to 1948. You can see that the Saturn-Neptune conjunction, which is underway now and is going to be taking us through to 2027 at least, is in its seventh house of this chart, the seventh house, allies, enemies, etc. Um, Saturn going into Aries in particular, I think, looks like some kind of trial, confrontation, etc., on war themes. And the other thing we can notice, the moon of the Israel chart, the moon which will signify the people and the general conditions of the country, is going to be opposed by Pluto beginning February next year. Pluto opposing the moon, 4 degrees of Aquarius, the moon at 4 degrees of Leo in 21 minutes. So we're going to see oppositions between Pluto and the moon. You know, oppositions tend to bring out the theme of confrontations or encounters with the other. Not necessarily confrontations, but in this case we have Pluto, right? Pluto, the lord of the underworld, death, rebirth, etc. That to me looks like a very intense confrontation that has very significant effects on the basic conditions and the people of the country. And then we look at Iran as well. Iran, this is the chart for when the Ayatollah Khomeini arrived in Iran and the revolution began. Um, Interestingly, this chart has Aries rising, where Israel has Libra rising. So there's some sense in which there's a sort of almost natural antagonism or relationship between Iran and Israel. Iran, Aries rising, Libra on the 7th. Israel, Libra rising, Aries on the 7th. So this Saturn-Neptune conjunction is very close to the ascendant of Iran. Saturn is going to move over the ascendant and the moon, which also looks challenging for the general conditions of the country. And that's coming over the next year. Neptune is also going to be going over the ascendant and the moon. One way you could maybe think about a Neptune transit like that is there's some sense of things becoming less solid or dissolving or being spiritualized. But you have to wonder, is this some deterioration of the conditions in Iran somehow? Pluto will also be running over this stellium of planets that Iran has in Aquarius as well over the next few years, which certainly looks difficult. So just looking at these charts, these are more indications that I think a lot more is yet to come for these countries. In 2027, we're going to see solar eclipse in Leo, which is going to be opposing the moon of this Iran chart. Now, eclipses that oppose the sun of the Iran chart, rather, eclipses that oppose the sun, they tend to be difficult confrontations. Um, and the sun in the chart can signify the leader of a country. So, you know, you heard about regime change being the goal here. Is this signaling trouble for Ali Khamenei, the leader of Iran, later on in this decade, in the middle of 2027? So that's some cyclical and chart factors that do seem to suggest that this conflict is not over, unfortunately. Let's just, before we go, just want to look at some big picture factors, because this is obviously a small piece of a bigger puzzle. Now, this is a chart just showing Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto for the end of the Second World War, which came on the 2nd of September 1945. Uranus was in Gemini, where it's about to return. Pluto was in Leo. It's now in Aquarius, the opposing sign. Neptune was in Libra. It's now in Aries, the opposing sign. So again, as with the nuclear age, so with the end of World War II, we're reaching a moment of big cyclical resonance here with the emergence of the post-World War II world. there is a big turning point coming here in terms of the world that emerged in the ashes of that war. So this is just to show these where things are likely to, where things are going planet-wise, right? We have uh, Pluto at 10 degrees of Leo at the end of World War II. Pluto's now at 3 degrees of Aquarius. So it's going to be later in this decade, actually, where Pluto will oppose its natal position towards the end of the 2020s. Neptune is going to make its opposition with its natal position in a couple of years. And same with Uranus. Uranus is just about to move into Gemini, right? We can see it here in the last degree of Taurus. It's going to move into Gemini, and about halfway through its Gemini transit, so let's say in about 3-4 years time, it's going to we're going to reach the Uranus return of the end of World War II. So we have these important moments for all these three very powerful outer planets coming. Something that I think is going on at a bigger scale, at a sort of deeper level with the world and geopolitics now, is that we've seen a lot of bifurcations, geopolitical bifurcations that emerged at the end of World War II. So we had this bifurcation of the whole world, essentially between the US and the USSR, right, which was the beginning of the Cold War after World War II. A few years after, we have China and Taiwan. So Taiwan and China, that's another bifurcation of this civilization, China. We have Israel Palestine, right? We have the founding of Israel in 1948. That's another pairing that you hear obviously so much about. North and South Korea is another one. India and Pakistan, formerly one people, one nation, now two. So we saw a lot of these bifurcations emerging, and there are tensions remaining in all these places right to this day. And I think that over the next few years, that unfinished business is probably going to be taken up again, unfortunately. A couple of years ago, I wrote a Substack article called Is a Global War Underway? And I was looking at the synodic cycle of Eris and Pluto. You can find this on my Substack, worldastrologyreport.substack.com. And I was looking at the synodic cycle of these two planets, Pluto, planet, the lord of the underworld, death and rebirth, and so forth, and Eris, the goddess of discord. And what I found looking at the relations between these two planets is that whenever they made major aspects, we saw global conflict going all the way back to the 7 Years' War in the 18th century. So that led me to the conclusion that probably we are already in a kind of global conflict. It's taking place in different theaters, right? We have Ukraine, we have the Middle East, and we potentially have others as well. I'm thinking of East Asia, China, Taiwan, etc. There's some sort of global conflict underway already. There's a big war, propaganda war between the sides. You could call this the second Cold War. And the main antagonists are the US and China this time. But obviously, US-China, so US-Russia rivalry is part of this, as it was in the first Cold War. So it seems that there is some sort of global conflict underway. I chose global war deliberately rather than World War III, because World War III, that's the big one that we're all scared about and worried about, because that seems to imply a similar situation to the Second World War, in which the parties really kind of fight to the end and throw everything that they have into winning and dominating the other side. And I'm not certain, and I'm hoping that that's not actually what we're going to see, even if things get a lot worse, which I think they almost certainly will, unfortunately. I'm not really convinced it will necessarily descend to that level that we saw in the other two numbered world wars. So I chose the term global war deliberately to avoid World War III and those connotations. And I have a reason why I'm shying away from saying, World War III is here. Um, and this could be wrong. I think with astrology, you have to think in terms of scenarios that you then mentally prepare for. It could be this or it could be this, and I'm mentally prepared for either eventuality. And I think that's the best way to go because we don't know the future for sure. But there is a Dutch astrologer named Robert Doulard who did a lot of studies of outer planet cycles, including one called Waves of Wars. And you can go to his website, Robert Doulard, Doolard, and he looked at wars and particularly major wars throughout history. And he looked at what the outer planets were doing at the time. And what he found is that when outer planet cycles are mostly in their waning phases, so that's the second half of the cycle when the faster planet is moving towards the slower planet rather than moving away from it. There are there's far more likelihood of having wars, and in particular, big wars at those times. Small wars can happen at any time. It doesn't really matter what the outer planets are doing. But he found that really in major wars, like the world wars or these huge conflicts that kill a lot of people, they're far, far more likely, overwhelmingly likely to happen when cycles are waning and not waxing. Now, the situation we're in now is that cycles are predominantly waxing. And this will be even more true next year after Saturn and Neptune make their conjunction in February 2026. Then almost all, I think it's 9 out of 10 of the synodic cycles that you can get from the 5 outer planets, from Jupiter to Pluto, 9 out of 10 of them will be waxing. And according to Doulard's research, that kind of suggests that some sort of major war, a massive world war, a World War III, if you like, is not so likely. Now, this doesn't prove that that can't happen, again, but it suggests to me that it won't, or there's a good chance that it won't happen. That even though things are going to get very hairy, probably we're going to have conflict in certain theaters around the world, that we're not going to get a kind of war of all against all, kind of fight to the death kind of World War II thing, which obviously with the weaponry that countries have these days, we don't want. And you can, I mean, we don't want any war, of course, needless to say, but and you might wonder if, well, maybe it's the fact that states have those weapons today and know that they could completely destroy each other is what will prevent things from reaching that level. The reason I think that waxing cycles don't tend to be correlated with war is that waxing is kind of, things are expanding and moving out into the world and coming into being, whereas waning cycles are more about consolidation and pruning and internal reflection and so forth. And so, wars, when they devastate things, they're kind of times when there's a pruning of things, so that the new can be born. We're not really at that kind of time in history, at least according to Doulard's research. So I've put that at the end of this presentation as a more hopeful note, which I hope at least points the way to the possibility that we're not going to see the worst outcomes here. But unfortunately, I do think we're going to see more conflict between Israel and Iran, which may well draw the US into it. So that's what I have for you today. And I hope this has been useful, interesting. Let me know what you think in the comments. I'm going to be back on YouTube very soon. I'm going to have a forecast episode for July. It's cooking right now and is almost ready to go. So I will see you soon. I wish you a good weekend Thanks for watching.